Welcome, everyone. My name is Javon Gord. I am a third-year PhD student in the School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering at Indiana University at Bloomington. And so for today, we're going to talk about ethics in video games and overview of ethical considerations and implications of video games, which means I want to talk about a lot of stuff. And I'm not going to lie to you, because I'm also like an academic. This presentation was created for 2.5 hours, and I have an hour, but really 50 minutes to talk to you about these things. So I'm going to not rush, but skim through some things, okay? Again, these topics can be their own panel in and of itself, and I'm just going to give you like a quick snapshot of some things, okay? I basically go with the format. If you have a question, then by all means, just ask it, but please keep it as like a brief, like clarifying question so we can keep going on, okay? So my goal is to hopefully go through all of this and then leave plenty of time for Q&A, okay? And also, I have another panel at 6 o'clock in panels room 5, and that is gamifying blackness, but I'll plug that in later, okay? So, are we ready? Are we ready? You're not ready yet, so it's okay. Okay, here we go. And so I have 3 main objectives. This scarf is getting too hot. Here, Sam, take this. Take my scarf. Thank you. Okay. I have 3 main objectives. Define the term video game and put it into an ethical perspective. Understand how virtual spaces incorporate ethical quandaries within gaming mechanics as they relate to ethical practices. And lastly, explore and examine ethical concerns and or implications within the video game industry. Again, it's a lot of things that we're going to talk about, but here are the main 3 things that I'm going to try my best to address, okay? So, I'm a games researcher, so I don't like to do presentations like slide 3 or 4. I have levels because it kind of just makes sense with the territory. So level 1, video games and exploration. What is a video game, right? Now, this is actually not a hyperbole or a rhetorical question. So yes, what do we think a video game is? Feel free to just shout it out because there's so many of you.
Series of meaningful choices.
That's very good. Wow. Okay, what else is there? There's a screen, right? And all of you are correct, right? And so I want to give you my own definition of it. A virtual interactive medium in which the user can input commands via controller, keyboard, a mouse to interact within the environment created with the following elements: a goal, rules, feedback system, and voluntary participation. Now, those 4 elements comes from this person named Dr. Jane McGonigal. And in her book called Reality is Broken, Why Games Make Us Better and How They Can Change the World, she has these 4 defining traits of a video game. So the goal is the specific outcome that players will work to achieve, right? So for example, all of you, your goal was to be here at MAGFest, right? So that is everyone's goal. The rules place limitations on how players can achieve that goal. Okay, you have to go through traffic. That's one of the rules, right? You have to find parking. That's another rule, right? Those kinds of things. The feedback system tells players how close they are to achieving the goal. So if you use like a GPS or something like that in order to get here, then that GPS is actually signifying to you how close you are getting to here. Does that make sense so far? And then lastly, they state, finally, voluntary participation requires that everyone who is playing the game knowingly and willingly accepts the goal, rules, and the feedback. Yes?
So how would you quantify sandbox games in relation to these groups like Minecraft? Does it have a specific goal?
Ooh, you say Minecraft? You hopped into my presentation. So I will address that. Okay, so this report is actually a year old. I meant to update it, but it's still relevant. So this series of statistics, probably can't say up here, this comes from the Entertainment Software Association Essential Facts Report. So every year they come out with a report that basically says this is what the video game industry, the American video game industry looks like at a glance. So right now we have the average gamer being around 35 years old and then currently worth for $30.4 billion in 2016. That number should be around $35 billion now as of last year, if I'm to be correct. So this is what the space that most of us are part of. This is part of the industry, the culture that we are immersed in. So now I'm going to jump ahead and talk about like contemporary video games, right? And so when we talk about ways of thinking about the video games that we all play in, we have our own way of viewing it. And then we also see like this progression through time. So in here we have Crash Bandicoot, right? Raise your hand if you ever played Crash before. Okay, fantastic. And so here we have on the further right side, the PlayStation 1 version of the game, right? And here on the left side, we have the newly updated, I think this game came out maybe like 2 years ago, the remastered version of the game. So you can see clearly here there's a big graphical difference, right? Where one is really blocky, right? Not everything has the best shading and all that stuff. Tessellation, if that's the thing to you, right? Now we have all of that, right? Polygons are more redefined. And then we have games like this, Horizon Zero Dawn. This is just a screenshot that I did, right? But you can obviously tell it's like, wow, this game is beautiful, and the game is beautiful. I've played it before, so it is immaculate. And side note, this is the same engine that Hideo Kojima is using for Death Stranding. I know, right? Okay, so when we start to think about games, right? When we start to think about this, we all should be aware of that games in and of itself has us learn, or we can learn from games in certain kinds of ways. And so Miguel Sicart, he wrote this book called The Ethics of Computer Games. And in it he says, in this book I claim that computer games are ethical objects, that computer game players are ethical agents, and that the ethics of computer games should be seen as a complex network of responsibilities and moral duties. Now, my question to you all is, raise your hand if you're an ethical agent. Everyone raise your hand. It's a trick question because, yes, all of you are an ethical agent. To be a person, to be living, breathing in this space, right? Your body that is physically present here means something to someone else, right? I don't feel like sitting next to that person. Well, that means, you see what I'm saying? Right? That person has their own agency. So that means we are all ethical agents. And the things that we interact with, video games, for example, is an ethical object in and of itself. Does that make sense? And then the second part, to understand the ethics of computer games, we have to take into account that computer games present simulated environments designed to be interacted with in specific ways by players who agree to those constraints and who, in most cases, cannot do anything to change the rules of possible interactions with the system. So that means when you sign up to play a particular game, you're signing up for whatever the developers want you to experience, right? We're not talking about if it's good or bad, right? We're just saying that this is what the game developers, whomever created this game, want you to experience, and you have to accept as it is at that moment. Does that make sense? Okay, so level 2, very cool for school. Yes, I created these titles myself. Okay, so why or why not should video games be used as an educational tool? Please explain this is how you know I'm a teacher. Please explain the consequences, right? So, but beyond that side, the second part, why or why not should video games be used as an educational tool, right? So raise your hand if you ever use video games as like part of a paper before, like to write about a video game as part of a paper. I mean, that's kind of my job, so, right? But raise your hand if you also played video games to actually learn something from the game in and of itself. Lots of us, right? But more than likely, lots of us also run into the issue where it's just like, why are you playing that stupid game, right? What are you getting from this, right? We hear this kind of rhetoric, right? So, what? Boom. Minecraft, correct? Yes, I told you I was going to address this. Okay, so Minecraft, right? Now, Minecraft, to address your question, is a sandbox game, right? In the context of a sandbox game, the goal is pretty much whatever you are, because the whole idea is you playing, quote-unquote, like a deity, right? You can do whatever you want. So the goal is pretty much up to you, per se, right? That's why, like, those 4 elements can be loose depending on, like, the interpretation of it. So yes. So when we talk about like games like this for educational purposes, we have games like Minecraft, right? So it's developed and published by Mojang. It's a three-dimensional sandbox game. Has like the survival and creative modes to it. And Microsoft bought the entire platform for $2.5 billion in 2014. Again, that's $2.5 billion. We're talking about some very serious money for one game. Does that make sense? Okay. And as of November 15th, when I had access to the data because they took it away from me, they had 27 million copies just on the Java edition, right? And we understand that Minecraft is pretty much on anything that you can look at a screen with, right? But we also see what happens when we start to take games a little seriously and then start to use it for an educational purpose. So we have here Minecraft Education Edition. In it, from the website that I got this information from, it says Minecraft Education Edition is a collaborative, versatile platform that educators can use across subjects to encourage 21st century skills. Whatever 21st century skills that means, we still got years to go, but still. And then spatial thinking and pixel art for students to work on mathematics and visual objectives in an engaging environment. Now, typically I show a video, but the video, if you go on like Coding for Creativity under the Minecraft Education Edition website, you'll see like this video of children actually interacting with Minecraft with their teacher at the same time. And then they're exploring like these new locales and these landscapes. And then are also learning computer science at the same time. You can program with inside Minecraft, right? And so they're learning that skill with inside this virtual environment. Now, when we talk about what games can be used for an educational purpose, we also have to think about, well, does every game fit what we think an educational agenda should be, right? Can every game be used as an educational lens? So in this game, Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, raise your hand if you know about Assassin's Creed. Cool beans. That is most of you. Okay. So in Assassin's Creed, you play as Ezio Auditore de Firenze. And the whole goal, right, the whole goal is to create a brotherhood, right, in which to take down the Templars, right? So your objective, your goal is to basically take out other enemies, right? However, you're going through like different historical locales, right? You interact with people like Leonardo da Vinci and stuff like that, right? You go through things that actually happen, right, in history, correct? How do we feel about having children play this particular kind of game to understand the history, right? Because now you have a game that has the setting, right? So you can say, okay, let's have these games teach or show children how to interact or what this landscape looked like at this time period, correct? Right? But we also have to wrestle with the fact that the only way to progress in this game, to see more of the landscape, they have to kill people, right? How do we wrestle with that? Again, I don't know the answer, but that's where we have to think about these kinds of things, right? And as a side note, I had a friend in high school who actually wrote his paper on Assassin's Creed. He used some of the examples in the game, like as the history, to write his history paper, and he got an A on it. Needless to say, I had to think about my career choices. Right, and so you have these things. In this side, you have the Guardian article that was written, and it says Assassin's Creed and the appropriation of history. And in this context, they actually wrote in here and said, I actually like how Assassin's Creed portrayed this particular landscape. They enjoyed that there was actually attention to detail in here. But again, there's attention to detail, so you can look at it from a very historical perspective. But again, the only way to progress is to kill people, right? How do you wrestle with that? Yes?
Assassin's Creed, they added a educational mode that allows you to walk around and see the ancient Egypt area without having to kill anyone. So they've actually sort of addressed that in the newest one. I think it was either free or they might have sold it as DLC.
More than likely, an educator like came across,
right.
And then there was like, you know, you should actually do this, and you say, oh yeah. Or one of them came to my panel last year, so you never. I'm still waiting for my money, but. You know, so you never know where these things can end up. But I'm glad to hear that. But this is not the only game that you have to wrestle with that, right? So mixed feelings, because that's how we all feel right now, right? So level 3 mixed feelings. Should people derive entertainment from video games that simulate violent, unlawful, or crude behavior? Would it be ethical to limit the amount of how often these games are produced? What do we think? This is an actual question. Yes.
Just generally when it comes to this question, like I know for movies, especially things like horror, people have the sense where you can experience or read, you know, you can enjoy a piece of media on a particular topic like this, experience something cathartically without you actually having to engage in the thing. Like most people know I should not be doing the things I'm seeing in a movie or playing in a video game.
I saw not your hand. I'm sorry, but his. Yes. Yeah.
Uh, I believe it's more important for the creators of any individual game to understand why they're doing what they're doing, and or to necessarily just place limitation on all violence or all crude behavior, because violence or any other crude behavior can be a valuable tool to understand how humans work, but you have to understand why it's there. You can't just have wanton violence and hedonism. It has to serve some sort of purpose, preferably to educate people on something about human people or about society.
Okay, I have to take one more to continue. All the way in the back. You. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of going off of what he said, it's more of just like creators just need to ask like, does the gameplay I'm implementing into my game mesh well with the general narrative that you're trying to go for? A big example is more often than not, I hear a lot of people say they like, the story and characters of the Bioware game, but the shooting aspect is something they just like put on because they said it's they just flow through it just so they can actually enjoy what they want in the game, and which they could have easily probably made it a more like dialogue option game where you navigate the game through more dialogue options as opposed to just like it's sort of like a first person shooter because that's what like excited people are more interested in playing. And older games did have a lot more different options for how characters play games, like mysteries, point and play, shooters. There were all sorts, and now I guess the issue is that it's just narrowed down to really,
Uh,
really relatively like based on us now.
yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. So there's a lot happening when we talk about video games and violence, right? There's a lot of things that people are trying to understand, and it's kind of hard to try and tease these things together because it's a lot of things happening at one time. And so, murder mysteries books can provide very detailed descriptions about the victims within this narrative, right? So when we talk about video games, we're talking about one form of media in general, right? So we have books that are very descriptive, right? So the person can merely just read the words, no visual component to the physical text, but those very details spark the human imagination in which we can cringe at the words like maim, splatter, and gore. Movies are able to take text and create a strikingly visual representation, such as in most horror films that show grotesque scenes of gore and violence. Yet, video games do not get the same treatment. There continues to be an ongoing conversation about video games and its association with violence. So, before we dig in deeper, I already have your opinions on this, so I'm very thankful for what everyone has said. And so, here I want to show you this group right here called the Mothers Against Video Game Addiction and Violence. I'm just presenting the information. That's all. That's all. I'm just presenting the information. Yeah.
I can get why people are asking this question, but why is it that the question gets asked of usually different forms of media, either visual, written, what have you, but not for something like um, sports, martial arts, or anything where you have people act, acting in a more aggressive manner, that's playing rugby or football.
a very good question, and I'm looking at the time, so I have to actually hold off the questions until the very end. Remind me of the question, because I have the answer, and it's surprisingly shorter than what I actually have in my head, which is nice. So, remind me, okay? So you have this group called Mothers Against Video Game Addiction and Violence. Again, this is just me presenting the information. Stated up here. Organization that is dedicated to educating parents of the world's fastest growing addiction and the most reckless endangerment of children today. Now, fastest growing addiction depends on who you talk to, and the most reckless endangerment of children today also depends on who you talk to. Okay. I try to look for more information, and since they haven't published anything, so this actually comes from 2008 or something like that. So they could be a defunct group, but there are people having these kinds of conversations. I just want everyone to be aware of that. And so this was the video, but we're going to skip the video. But pretty much in this video, there is a conversation on CBS Morning Rounds, which is just a conversation with Gayle King, and he just has a conversation with someone, right? In this one, they bring on a psychologist who's talking about video game addiction, right? And on its surface, it seems pretty interesting, right? But then when you actually look at where the data comes from, it's talking about gamers in Singapore. Right? So that means if you're a parent and you're on the go and you're not really paying attention, but you hear video games, addiction, and you see a chart in statistics, right? You would think that they're immediately talking about where you live, right? The US context, right? And so when you talk about other games from different kind of landscape, you're talking about a whole nother culture related to gaming, right? The way South Koreans play gaming, vastly different than how US based people play video games. Can we agree on that?
Yeah.
Right? I won't say too different, but there are ways in which the society placates to it, right? At least in the Korean sense, that you have more PC bangs, cafes, more than what the US has. Is that a fair statement to say? Yeah. Fantastic. So back to the essential facts report, right? And so on here we have a 20 best list of top selling video games in 2017. And so we have Call of Duty, World War II, NBA 2K18, Grand Theft Auto, etc., etc., etc. So out of this 20, you actually have half of these games related to first-person shooters, first-person shooters, right? And then you also have this percentage where it's 21.9% action games and 25.9% shooters, right? So on its surface, there's a lot of people who are really, really invested into playing these kinds of games. But when you look at history, right, especially these reports, that is actually an increment over time. It's not like everyone's just oh, I love first-person shooters to the day I die, and then that's it. It's because more and more have been developed over time since then, right? Does that make sense? So actually about 6-7 years ago, this number of shooter games was around the 15-10%. It was pretty small in comparison to everything else. This is a slow change over time. So what I want to also talk about is about the representation of different kinds of video games and what they try to instill. So here, this is Mafia 3. Raise your hand if you know about Mafia, heard of Mafia 3 at least, right? Okay. So Mafia 3 is a controversial game based on controversy. Mafia 3 takes place in 1968 New Bordeaux, which is fictionalized New Orleans. The time period is crucial to understand the game's themes, in-game landscapes, vehicles, actions, and most importantly, people. Racial tensions are high, the Vietnam War is still ongoing, and Richard Nixon is elected president. Needless to say, these were troubling times. You can play as Lincoln Clay, a half-black man who just came back from the Vietnam War, so he's a veteran. And you return to your home of New Bordeaux and get accustomed to civilian life again. After a major heist later on, you are suddenly betrayed by your partner. Therefore, Lincoln Clay goes from fighting a war abroad to fighting a war at home. So, displayed here is a disclaimer written by the creators of Mafia 3 Hangar 13 Studios that is shown to the player at the beginning of the game. And it reads, Mafia 3 takes place in a fictionalized version of the American South in 1968. He sought to create an authentic and immersive experience that captures this very turbulent time and place, including depictions of racism. We find the racist beliefs, language, and behaviors of some characters in the game aberrant, but believe it is vital to include these depictions in order to tell Lincoln Clay's story. Most importantly, we felt that to include not this very real and shameful part of our past would have been offensive to the millions who face and still face bigotry, discrimination, prejudice, and racism in all of its forms. This is at the very beginning of the game. So when I popped in my disc and I saw this, and I'm just like, oh, they know exactly what they created. They know exactly what they're trying to do. They know exactly what history they're trying to pull from and then show that as like a consumer product. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Because not all studios do this kind of work, but they should. So this is actually an article that I wrote. Should a black character be able to kill members of the KKK?
Yes.
Let me get my water. Your words, not mine. Okay, here we go. So, in here, skip. Okay, yeah. So, this is an article I wrote because around this time, there was actually some controversy around a particular gameplay mechanic in which people found out that you, as Lincoln Clay, can kill members of the KKK. And there were people that were actually pretty upset because they were claiming that is historically inaccurate. And I'm just like, well, right? They were claiming historical inaccuracy, right? But then it's very interesting on how we view black bodies being able to only go through certain spaces and not others, right? So to claim historical inaccuracy in this context means that you somehow are trying to say it was okay for the KKK to do this in the first place, therefore we must also have these same visualizations and interpretations in the game that we have currently present. Does this make sense? So, it's typically a video that I show. So this link is actually a video of Lincoln Clay actually killing a member of the KKK. So, but I won't show that video. I couldn't pull it up. But, I know, right? It would have been fun. But, what I am having up here is a actual conversation that is held between two KKK members. So think of Lincoln Clay being behind some hay bales, and this is the conversation you hear, and I'll read it as follows. First member. And I'm going to use the language in here, okay? See how they came waltzing in, decked out in their fancy white robes. My daddy used to say the only thing worse than a nigga is a rich man putting on airs. Ain't that the goddamn truth? Those assholes come out for Mr. Duval's speech, might even hoot and holler and wave their arms around. But me and you both know when it's time for us to get our hands dirty, time for us to collect ourselves some nigger scouts, anyone wearing one of those fucking robes will vanish real quick. Someday, I wouldn't mind doing to them what they're planning to do onto them niggas, right? That is in the game, right? That is the language, right? Verbatim, word for word, right? And then you see this, right? So at the top is an image of Lincoln Clay, like waiting for the KKK member to come across, right? And then at the bottom, you see him like stabbed, right? So how do you think about the justification in that? Because on its surface, it's just a gameplay mechanic. He's just another enemy. But culturally, this means something, correct? But how do you wrestle with that? Sub-boss battle, right? Right? So, video games are a visually interactive medium. Therefore, players may have choice as far as what steps to take to complete a task. Mafia 3 takes a step further and complicates what player choice means by integrating real-world events of contention and strife. So simply, what are your thoughts and feelings after examination of Mafia 3? This is a rhetorical question because we don't have time. But I'm sure enough you have thoughts and feelings. So the next part, level 4, decisions. Raise your hand if you played The Walking Dead, like the Telltale series game. Okay, awesome. So, I don't want to get too philosophical, but life is a series of decisions. You as a student decided, this is how you know I'm a teacher. You as a MAGFest attendee decided to be here, right? there are things put in place to give illusions that you have little control, or sometimes, right? So that means getting here, you have to pay like money to be at MAGFest. So it's all of its own thing, right? But anywho, you made a conscious choice decision to be here and at my panel, so thank you. Right? So just like in games like Overwatch, you have to be aware of particular kinds of decisions. In the context of Overwatch, it is strategy, right? Pocket Mercy, Pharah, all that stuff, those are conscious decisions people are making. Does it piss me off? Sure. Like, we'll talk about nerfs and buffs and why Brigitte needs to be buffed. Anywho, but right, but these are conscious decisions, right? So in this kind of game, in Telltale, is really a series of choices that you have to make. And so, I don't think I have a video, yeah. But here I typically show a video. And in this video, it's a particular scene, spoiler, not spoiler, the game's been out for 4 years, so whatever. There's a part where you have to choose between saving like the farmer's son or one of the survivor's son, right? And you have to make the conscious decision. So it's just like, okay, do I choose like to save the son of the person that I'm actually seeking refuge at? Or do I choose to save like the survivor's son knowing that there's a chance I may be like the person will be upset and kick me out, right? You have to think about those kind of things, right? And so how do you wrestle with that? Raise your hand if you played any of the Fable games, right? I heard they're actually making 4. Rumor mill, but you didn't hear from me. So in Fable 3, which is now at the Funk Studio, right, it's all about decision making, right? So you play as a king, right? I know, I wish you could be like a queen. You play as a man, all right? And so you play as the king. And in this game, it's really about good and evil. You have to make a series of decisions. And at the end of Fable 3, of the story arc, really, you have to now think about, do you want to fulfill the promises that you made? Because in order to fight the war, you have to make allies. So you are making promises across the game. But now, when it's time to collect, they're asking you, hey, remember that thing you said you were going to do for me? Now I want that thing, right? But then you have to think about, your kingdom is only worth but so much money, and that war was pretty expensive. So that means you can be benevolent, but that means you'll go broke. Or you can be evil, and that means you keep the money for yourself, but then people start to hate you, right? So how do you deal with that? And then level 5, the environments of creation. I want to get the wording right on this one in particular. Okay. Behind every video game is at least a person or a team of people who devote lots of time, energy, and money into creating their ideal world, which they hope appeals to the masses. This is a snap from a video by Insomniac Games, the creators of Ratchet and Clank, opposing the president's not a travel ban. So according to the Entertainment Software Association's Central Facts Report, there are 2,322 video game developer locations across all 50 states. There are 526 publisher locations across 44 states. However, while being a mere consumer of video games is fun in some regard, game creation sometimes is not. This book, Beyond Mario Mortal Kombat, is a collection of articles from computer researchers and game developers. In the article written by Dr. Mia Consalvo from Concordia University, she explored workplace challenges within game development, specifically focused on the experiences of women. So in here comes from that same article called Crunch by Passion, Women, Game Developers, and Workplace Challenges. And so it's a series of interviews, and one of them says the most frequent concern mentioned was crunch time. Even large companies, which should be in better position to add staff or plan extra time, do not shy away from crunch time. So raise your hand if you're like a student, or was a student, or what have you, right? Raise your hand if you ever written a paper that is due in the next 5 hours or so. Think about that, but that's always your job, right? For 50 hours, if not more. So here's one from a respondent named Sylvia. We had minimum 12-hour days, 14 hours per firm. Permission was required to leave the building. They wanted to make sure we finished, or if we needed to leave, we had to check. They let us out one Sunday after 8 hours and told us we should be grateful we didn't have to stay for 12. Right? So the International Game Developers Association IGDA has these codes of ethics. So it's pretty much saying, okay, if you're a game developer, your gaming company should abide by these rules, and you, the developer, should also abide by these rules as well. And some of it is just like respect intellectual property rights, right? Seek fair rights to ownership of content that we create, etc., etc., etc. Right? Okay, I know, right? Possible, very on the nose. But after all of this, who is responsible for upholding ethical standards in the creation or consumption of video games? Is it the parents? Is it the game developers? Or is it the players? Again, remember how I asked if we were ethical agents, right? All of us are ethical agents, regardless of what social status that you identify with, right? But who has the final say-so? Who is responsible? I have my answer, but I'm very interested to hear whatever other people have to say. Yeah. Yeah.
After having studied video game design and academically in college, at this point I think I can safe to say, in my own opinion, that it's a joint responsibility. It's not just one group who's responsible. Because the game developers, they make the game, but they pretty much go off the consumers' feedback, like what are they buying? What are they buying the most of? Parents, they essentially help control what younger players will actually play, purchase. And players, they help influence what game developers make. Mm-hmm. So it's not just one party who bears all the responsibility. It's a group responsibility.
Yes.
The state of the unions being what they are in America, it's difficult to hold the individual workers at a game development company responsible, so it tends to fall to the upper levels of management. And for any individual consumer, most of the downfalls for any boycott will actually fall to the individual workers rather than anyone in upper level management.
I say most of the time, I think it's whoever has the money. What say is you're buying the game audience, basically.
I'd say it's the consumer. I think people, they will make what people buy. And I think that's the sad truth. Things like predatory practices, microtransactions, whatever, people buy it. So I think at the end of the day, you're never going to get a governing body to do it. It's got to be us.
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
I think there's kind of like two sides to the ethics. The ethics of the creation. There, the onus is on the developers to treat their people right. A 14-hour day on a Sunday, that's wrong. As far as content goes, I think gaming is like any other art form. If you're making a game called Mafia about criminals, they shouldn't shy away from criminal activity happening in the game any more than Quentin Tarantino should not show somebody's head blown off in Pulp Fiction because at that point, as far as the content goes, that's on the consumer. The product is out there. The consumer and the parents, in the case of young children, should be the ones deciding, my kid should or shouldn't have this, not they shouldn't make this in case my kid gets it.
There's a person all the way in the back.
So it's really not a question that can be answered. Each of those categories are people that are autonomous. They have their own roles to be fulfilling. So they're each responsible because everyone's responsible for their individual social relations and in their lifetime. Right?
Yes.
I think in the case of like game mechanics with malicious intent, like someone mentioned microtransactions and stuff like that. Things like gambling with games, like anything that involves chance, we've deemed as a country that people need to be protected from things like gambling because of the way that addiction works. And I think that in the same vein, game developers can make things that are purposely malicious to feed into addiction. And I think that if we deem that real gambling is unacceptable, except in certain places, then virtual gambling should be unacceptable.
Yes.
So It's a very complex question, which has a lot of layers. In a general answer, everybody's involved and everybody's responsible, but there's different layers. Really, who's responsible when, depending on the age group. If it's a certain age group, then really it's the parent or the guardian that's responsible in educating that child, as well as society and their environment as a whole. But if it's an older adult, the answer changes or the question changes. They may actually be educated on what they should be maybe consuming and how they should be consuming it as far as how they should be interpreting it, but they're not actually interpreting the way they should. But also, just as a video game developer, your question is, who is my game supposed to appeal to? What type of audience? And do I really trust that that audience is going to be educated on this matter in the way that I would want them to be in order to consume it properly or responsibly or ethically? And I think there's way too many layers that it really depends on also governments. Which government is this, which country are you consuming this product in, and how does that government, interpret it, and what laws are in place in that country? And then the answer completely changes on who's responsible. So I think there's just so many layers. In general, like a general overlaying, answer is everybody's responsible. But there's just so many layers underneath. It really depends.
I'll take you as the last one.
Okay. So this is going to be just about there's so many different dimensions of this, as you mentioned, but the labor side sticks in my craw the most. And, corporations, they're apparently legally people now, but they don't, thank you, Hobby Lobby, they don't have the same needs or motivations as actual flesh and blood people. There's no set life, there's no 80-year maximum or so lifespan on a corporation. Their parts are wholly swap-outable. You can fire every last person in a corporation and hire them back on again as a completely different thing, thank you Toys R Us, with zero repercussions. So it is their responsibility to handle labor stuff in a practical manner. However, they are immoral to their core. They do not care, nor have they been made to care about what they do to their workers, what they do, aside from basically to, insofar as offending people's sensibilities with violence or sex or vulgarity or whatever. Everybody's so upset that they saw Liara's side boob by accident, but nobody cares that League of Legends laid off every single person that made the KDA video after it was done. The second it hit the gold version, goodbye everyone, have a nice time.
Very excellent points.
Sorry.
All good points. So just some final wrapping up stuff. So, as I call it, downloadable learning content. Again, I create all this. Again, so just to refresh our memories, video games, right, as I mentioned, are a virtual interactive medium, right? And it has the 4 elements: goals, rules, feedback, system, voluntary participation. But of course, these elements are not all encompassing, right? I won't want to say that these are the only 4 main elements, right? There could be others, but in my mind, this gets close to that. So keep in mind that video games, again, are ethical agents, that are ethical objects, which means that the game in and of itself can do things onto you and then vice versa. Does this make sense? Yeah. But you, the person, are ethical agents, which is why when we have rhetoric that says, don't spend too much time on that video game, well, that video game could be part of your salient identity, right? So therefore, playing League, playing Overwatch, right, that could be just your thing, right? So to detach yourself from that thing, right, could be a misnomer from your identity. However, the game also is still a game, right? Therefore, there could be changes or switches, right, that could be doing things onto you, and we just must be aware of those things. Does this make sense?
Yes.
Right? So gaming environments are gateways to educational development, but it is up to the game creators and players to find and justify the educational value, right? Does that make sense in the context of having Minecraft versus teaching an Assassin's Creed course? I would love to teach that course, but we must fundamentally assess what these games are trying to communicate with us and figure out for ourselves if a certain game conflicts with our own sense of ethics and morals. Video games have the power to question what we think right or wrong implies, therefore may lead us to question our own sense of ethics, right? So when you have to choose between who to give your crackers to, right, this hungry child, or keep it for yourself, you have to wrestle with that. Does that make sense? Unethical practices are slated to happen within any workplace environment, especially in bustling industries. We as consumers and producers must develop and implement our own code of ethics and discuss those with others, therefore leading to work environments that share a set of values and responsibilities that all must uphold, right? So that means it's not just on the onus of the company, but it's on you, the worker, to state that to the company in and of itself. You're fine. Okay? Does this make sense? So that's it. Thank you. So there's like 14 minutes left, and there's a microphone, I believe, right here. So if you can just line yourself up, then by all means. Thank you. Here we go.
Yeah, I was just wondering if I could get your thoughts on the ramifications of violence in video games, specifically in those in which the only way to meaningfully interact within the world is through violence.
So, repeat your question again.
What are the ethical ramifications of violence in a world where all you can do is violence?
Oh, okay. Well, when it comes to that comes down to the mechanic of what the game, it comes down to what the game's objective is, right? Therefore, you can't question that this game is too violent unless it is in such a way that is kind of reflecting that of like a very masochistic kind of like culture, right? So therefore, for example, if I think it's called like Hate or Reach or something. There you go. It was that game, very controversial game, right? Because of its grotesque violence. However, in Call of Duty, there's a part called No Russian, right? Where literally you can go around shooting all the people in the airport. However, you can skip that part, but most people don't know that, right? That was the whole like, oh, yeah. But what they did was they said that you can skip that part if you wanted to. Right? And so it does teeter this line between, well, what is acceptable violence? Because there are forms of acceptable violence. That's why we have rating systems, right? That's why HBO gets away with certain things that a CBS station can't get away with. Does this make sense?
Yeah.
So when it comes to a video game perspective, it's a hard question because the game developer has to wrestle with that ethical question, but then you have to also wrestle with, why are you playing this game, right? Like, why in particular are you playing this game, right? And if you're seeing it as too inherently violent, but you still want to keep playing, then that's something that you have to wrestle with. I don't necessarily have the question to that, right? What violent is too violent is still something that we're still, like, debating about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, what violence is too violence, and also how much is this violence a choice on the part of the player?
Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, so just remember, how is it against control? Why do you think at least people are bringing up the ethics in media and video games? When you are watching someone do something terrible or doing something terrible in a video game, but people don't bring up the ethical problem in
Violent sports.
in martial arts or violent sports. Like, I can, kill a bunch of enemies in a video game, but I'm not slamming into someone like in rugby. Isn't there a different ethical standard if one I'm actually harming another person?
It's an acceptable form of violence. Does this make sense? Therefore, football is inherently violent sports, right? Because it's literally guys, mainly guys, right? Well, all of them, right? Hitting each other, and then it's to the point that they get massive concussions, right? But yet, there's still going to be a Super Bowl coming up, right? Does this make sense? It's an acceptable form of violence. right? It's a seminal form of violence that a particular generation prides themselves on having, right? Therefore, with people in gaming culture, which started around the 80s, right, but really matriculated and got its stride in the 90s, right, that had its own generation, right? But we have to do the work, and I say we as the collective people in gaming culture, right, have to do the collective work of showing or providing a way for other previous generations and newer generations, so people after us, of ways of viewing this medium, right? But we cannot obfuscate what it is. Football is violent, rugby is inherently violent, you see what I'm saying? But someone like MAGFest made the argument that Mario is inherently violent, right? So it's just an acceptable form. I don't think the question, like the ethics question, if this is new or like sprung up, is necessarily new, but is it a thing? Yes, because we now have games like League of Legends that is now entering home. We have like a Fortnite, right, that is now taking the world by storm, and parents are freaking out because they're like, I don't know what this means to keep playing this thing. Those kind of things. When you have a massive stereo over something, that's when people start to ask the questions. Does that make sense? Is it real quick? Because
yeah. Isn't there such, wouldn't you argue that there's a difference between football, where you sign up for football, you're playing football, and a video game where, certain video games where you're say killing civilians? Would you argue that that's a difference?
There's consent, but does that remove it's a violent act or not? I don't think so. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, loot boxes, am I right?
Can we not literally?
Not here, man.
Continue.
Another question, if you don't mind.
No. I'm just joking. Go for it. Yeah.
I'm just curious what your take is on that and where the others falls.
So I'm
if you want me to ask another question.
So I'm a games researcher. I am surrounded by 7 game scholars all day, every day, right? When this whole loot box, Star Wars Battlefront, all that came out, we were in the office just like, what all that, right? It's a mess. I don't even have the correct answer for you because it's such a mess. I think it's just very interesting and also it's interesting when governments start to like dabble into something because half the time they don't know what they're dabbling into, right? It's just that with loot boxes, once someone said that this is gambling, they're just like, oh, they're making money off of this? How can we make money? Okay, right? It's very tricky, right? Like loot boxes in Overwatch, right? It's a toss-up if you get that Nutcracker skin for Zenyatta, right? Which I never got, I had to actually buy it. But besides the point, right? It's very, very tricky, right? Is it different than in Battlefront 2, right? Yes, no, maybe so. It depends. So I don't have an actual answer for you because of how messy it is, but do know I'm aware of it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I wanted to, well, first ask permission to maybe within this topic, but it's a little bit broader, which is talking about how not just within video games, but video games are being used within the YouTube sphere and the Twitch sphere, and different ways. Talking mostly, I'll just say PewDiePie, and start going in that route. And it's that acceptable to ask in this forum.
Go for it.
All right. So there's been recent research basically showing that whether it bears responsibility or not, has actually been leaning kids who've been watching more video game walkthroughs and that things, actually starts leading them down towards alt-right path, anti-feminist views, that kind of thing. It has shown, PewDiePie in and of himself has always been a controversial figure, but his most recent times he's attacking people of color at this point in time. What is then the responsibility of the video game industry, and as well as things that have brought the other mediums to come up due to the video game industry, such as streaming services? What kind of responsibility within the ethics sphere do they bear, if any at all?
Nice question. Almost had me though. It's a cultural problem.
Absolutely.
Does this make sense?
Oh yeah.
It's a cultural problem to such a degree that, for example, they can moderate the hell out of YouTube all they want. You'll never get rid of a racist.
Mm-hmm.
Does this make sense? They'll just find someplace else to go. Right? And so that's like Twitch. Now when it comes to children, right? That's also very tricky because I'm not a psychologist, but on its surface, you have children that are learning their world. Does this make sense? So
Can I push back a little bit?
Yeah.
Which is, it's with the respect to a racist can go anywhere. They can.
Yeah.
Luckily, there's been this movement to shut down any place that they go to, taking away their funding, that kind of thing. My concern is where you have like YouTube is, they financially gain revenue due to actually the racist being on there, because what they do is they don't want people to stop watching videos. So they suggest videos, and they suggest then, hey, watch this video. Somebody said something negative about video games. How dare they? Well, then also this person said something negative about men, therefore you should have more of an anti-feminist view, and then leads them down towards even more of a rabbit hole. And YouTube has been profiting off of this, and right now their CEO has been remaining pretty quiet on what their responsibility is. Versus, hey, there's a racist video on YouTube, you have to kind of find it, versus YouTube goes, well, based off your past search, we don't want to lose the ad revenue. Here's a plethora of other racist views because you seem to watch those in the past.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Yeah.
That means there just has to be a baseline of what is tolerable or acceptable on the platform. YouTube does not have that.
Yeah.
They're now trying to figure out what that is. Because if they would have started with that from the beginning, I would like to think they wouldn't be in much of a mess dealing with a person like PewDiePie. Because the problem when you allow someone when you don't have a baseline or where to draw the line, you start to push it however you see fit. PewDiePie is a very interesting example because he's amassed such a following that YouTube, and partially, I won't say relies on him, but he's so much a part of the YouTube algorithm in and of itself. He's very influential, right? And so with him, they could easily just say, okay, we're just going to kick you off of YouTube. But is YouTube ready for the pushback? Because there will be. The moment YouTube outright bans PewDiePie, you will hear it across the globe because he has that much power on their own platform, right? Because how is YouTube supposed to know this is going to be a thing now? But that's because they had no base minimum. More than likely, no one ever read or written a code of ethics in YouTube until maybe a few years ago, and they're still trying. I mean, Twitch is in that situation, right?
Yeah, they recently had brought back a person who beat his wife.
Yeah, because where's the baseline?
Yeah.
Right? And where's the baseline? Okay, well, can we actually intervene in someone else's personal life?
Because the platforms are such a big part of the culture at this point for video games.
Right.
Yeah.
There needs to be some sort of standard.
So it's hard and it's very contentious.
Yeah.
Right.
So sorry for broadening the discussion beyond just within video games itself.
It's
but
my job.
But thank you.
Yeah. So I'll take 2 more formally, but I'll still be around to take more questions afterwards. Okay, so feel free to just come up to me afterwards. But yeah, go for it.
This is kind of piggybacking off of all the other comments, but I'm just going to cut to the chase. How would you introduce the idea of ethical consumption, to the broader view and to the broader public eye? As in, would you have it introduced in schools? Would you include it in media consumption, or how to consume media? Because video games are media. So would you start with, would you add a class, or we can just talk about it like we're doing now, but I feel like it's good to introduce ideas and say how YouTube is crap, and it kind of is, but we need to start thinking about what we can do and how we can address these things individually, and whether we're consciously or unconsciously contributing to a problem.
Right. So me being here brings hopefully gives everyone a chance to be aware of these kind of things, have you wrestling with kinds of questions, right? But I don't work for a YouTube or Twitch or anything like that. Therefore, we need people in those spaces to actually have the institutional power to implement said changes based off those ideas. Because we can talk all day, but we don't do actual like things, right? Then it will keep reiterating itself or take new life in new form, right? That's pretty much what institutional racism it lives on, thrives on, right? Does this make sense?
Yes.
So how to have something like that? It's a hard question because I would like to say I want everyone to be aware of media consumption, not just in schools, but the place you work in, whatever. But there also needs to be actual laws, practices, norms set in place within the culture to make sure that is a reoccurring thing, right? Like recycling is part of the public consciousness, right? But we've been trying to recycle for years, right? It is only now where hotels such as this is just like, we should actually put recycling bins in our hotels. What about that, right? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And one last thing, developers. Out of the trio, developers should share the onus of responsibility. That's what I think.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry.
Hello.
Hi.
So I actually wanted to go back to the discussion of, violence in games, particularly, often first-person games. And the thing is that, like, where is the line drawn for what's like, this sort of comes back to the whole idea of video games as power fantasy that was very popular a few years back, which a lot of people have criticized recently, but, like, for example, the mobile game Bury Me, My Love is basically a text adventure of you are a Syrian man and your wife is attempting to get asylum in Europe, and you have to make suggestions to her via text, and that's pretty much the amount of control that you have. But there is a lot of content in there that is certainly violent. So, like, when we discuss, like, violence in video games, like, how much of it are we discussing, do you think, the empowerment fantasy of violence versus the mere content?
It's a very... I don't know much about the power fantasy as a concept for me to dig into.
Oh yeah, but like the standard is sort of like, the satisfying punching an alien until it explodes kind of thing. It's like that's the kind of violence that is very, palatable because it makes people feel good. But when games or like Papers, Please is essentially about institutionalized violence, but it's on that level it's a very boring game because it's it's just you stamping papers or not stamping papers.
I think part of it comes down, there's a lot, but I think part of it also can be chalked up to what is the purpose of it.
Yeah.
Now, if you're just trying to punch a thing just to punch a thing because it makes you feel good,
yeah.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, intent matters.
Right, but if you are punching a thing because it's supposed to be speaking to like this greater social issue, then that's also just as salient or viable for someone to think.
Yeah.
So when it comes to like violence and all that stuff, it's hard for me to have a ready question because there is no perfect answer to it.
Oh, of course not.
Right? But I do think that if you're going to put violence in your game, it should be meaningful in some way.
Yeah.
How meaningful that is completely dependent upon like the person.
I'm an LGBTQ creator as well, and similar things come up where LGBT content often is treated as inherently like adults only, whereas people have gotten away with a lot more risque stuff that was very much cis male gaze oriented and PG games aimed at teens. So
I think that's very interesting because queer people have been around since beginning of time.
Well, yeah, but
so
we have to remind people sometimes.
And I'm just like, so we have problems about LGBTQ love, but we have men in like museums shacked up together. But yet that's art. That's queer art.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
The way people over time justify particular kinds of actions.
Yeah.
Right. That's part of the issue.
Yeah, I just remember the particular thing with the LGBT tag on Steam disappearing completely, making it virtually impossible for people who wanted video games on the largest distributor of them to actually find ones that were about queer themes. And that's very troubling, since we face a lot of censorship with regards to intentional mature content that's trying to say something, whereas a lot of AAAs and stuff sort of can skid by, with brains exploding everywhere and boobs all over the place. Yeah. I just thought that would be something interesting to.
Thank you.
Of course.
So I'm way over time.
I'm so sorry.
It's not your fault, but thank you all for being here. I greatly appreciate it. I'm around for a few more minutes.